but this is the flower that I'm going to be doing for this tutorial. So it's a tulip. So as I'm sketching this tulip, I'm really just very lightly looking at how the petals relate to each other. When I've been teaching myself to draw flowers, I think the biggest thing that I really look at is the negative space, especially between the petals, because I think, a lot of the mistakes that I made when I was learning to draw, especially with flowers, is, the angle of the petals would be wrong, or one side would be, when I look back at it, would be completely, the angle would be wrong, the size would be wrong. And I think that what's really helped me is looking at the edges. Where do they meet the one petal? Where does it meet the other petal? Looking at my reference photo, and then looking at that negative space. What is the shape of that space between the petals? Those things really help my eye to kind of figure out what I'm drawing. So here I've decided to use a really fine liner. It's an 01. And unlike some of my other drawings where I didn't put the veins, this one I decided to use my fine liner on the interior of the flower a little bit more, because the tulip is so simple. I think that's really what it was. And add a lot more detail with the pen itself. I'm just looking at where those, I don't know if they're really called veins. I don't really know what they're called, but whatever the lines are inside the petal, and just really giving an indication of where they are and the direction of the petal. Kind of defines the shape of the petal a little bit more. So here's some fun trivia. When I was painting this in my sketchbook, I like to learn facts about my topic because I like to write the facts in my sketchbook. So I looked up some information about tulips, and it turns out that in the 1600s in the Netherlands, tulips were so valuable that in some cases they were worth more than houses in the Netherlands. There was this period of time where they were actually like as expensive as a house. So I thought that was very interesting. So here's a little painting that I did in my sketchbook of a house in the Netherlands in the 1600s. So for painting, I'm starting off with what's basically just a really light wash. It only looks a little pink because I mixed up pink and turned my water a little pink, but that's okay because I'm mostly going to be using pink. This pink color I created on my tulip. So I'm putting water throughout my tulip, and I don't really care too much if I go outside the lines in my first application. My first application or layer is very loose. As I go through and add more layers, I'm going to get a little tighter because, you know, I'll be glazing, using mostly a glazing technique. But my first layer, I have no problem with it just kind of, you know, loosely going over. I'm just kind of adding that first layer of color that would be the very, very lightest. Now in a couple of spots, I'm going to try to leave it as, you know, completely white. I'm going back, it's still pretty wet here, and I'm going back into the areas where I see a little bit more darkness, and I'm just tapping in a little bit more color. I'm letting it bleed into the down into the petal. I'm still considering this pretty much the first layer though. So this is what I would call a wet on wet technique so far. I'm just going back into the petals. It's still very, very wet. Not so wet though that I can't control the paint. And I think that's a really important distinction when you're doing wet on wet. You always should be able to control your paint. If your image is so wet that the paint just goes anywhere, then you have way too much water. So when you put your water on your image to begin with, always put just a very, very light coat. And then you can build up the water in the areas where you want the pigment to go. That gives you control. Because even when you're doing wet on wet, you still want to control where the pigment goes. It's okay for there to be, you know, what I call happy accidents when the paint flows into other areas, because it's watercolor and that's kind of what it does. But I try to make sure that it's, you know, my decision and not the paint just doing whatever it wants. Okay, so now the flower has dried a little bit. It's still damp, but it's definitely not wet. So the pigment is going exactly where I want it to go, and it's staying there. So this is what I personally call glazing. I think that is what most people call glazing. So this is where you're building the color by putting another color on top. I've actually taken, now it's a darker mixture of pink, and I'm going on top of my lighter pink, and the two colors are mixing together basically to make a different color. When I take my paintbrush, a wet paintbrush with no color on it, and just push it up against the edge, that will soften that hard edge. So that's what I'm doing right there. And that's how I'm creating the darkness, or what I would say, it's not really dark, but it just has a more pigmented shading there on the edge of that petal. Now I'm doing the same thing in the areas that I see more color or more pigment. I am going to be coming in later with a really, really light gray to add shadows as well. So right now I'm really not looking at shadows so much as I am looking at just the darker pink. As I continue to build up that color and soften those edges, I'm going to tell you my next piece of trivia about tulips, and that is that you can eat the petals, and apparently they taste like onions. People use them in other cultures as an onion replacement. So I think that's kind of funny. So I'm letting the tulip dry, and I've mixed up kind of a sap green, and I'm starting in on the background, which is very loose. I've decided to make the green leaves, but I'm not going to be real tight with these because, for one thing, the picture doesn't really show them. It was important to wait till my tulip was dry to do this because I didn't want the green to bleed into my tulip, because I'm going around the edges of the tulip here. Once this background dried, it definitely needed more work, so I'm going back in with more water and green and softening up this background. So watercolor has a tendency to dry really light, and it can need a lot of coats depending on the color. I think the darker the colors, often the more layers you need. If you look really closely at the reference photo, you'll see just a hint of yellow on the petal. So I took a really light yellow wash and went on top of my dried flower. Now I'm going in with a very light wash of gray that I mixed up. I think this is actually Payne's Gray, so I didn't mix this, I just used it directly from the tube. And I'm putting in the shadows that I see. I think it's scary for a lot of people to add shadows, especially gray shadows, on flowers because it seems counterintuitive to add gray to a bright thing, but it really actually, if you look at the reference photo, there's a lot of gray on there, and I think that it adds a lot. I hope you enjoyed. If there's something in particular that you want to see me paint, leave a comment and I will paint it for you.